This camera is probably one of the most extraordinary and meticulously engineered cameras I've ever shot with. In fact, I'm struggling to think of another camera that has been quite so ambitious in its design. But the funny thing about it is that for once, it's not the imaging technology inside it that makes it so interesting to me. It's actually what's on the outside. You see, this is like the Navy SEAL of mirrorless cameras. It's tough, it can handle itself underwater, and in a pinch, you can use it to beat information out of people. Please don't try that at home. Anyway, this is the Nikon 1AW1, and it's freeze-proof, waterproof, and even shockproof, meaning you can do stuff like this. And yes, even though I know it is designed to be able to stand up to that kind of stuff, it still makes my balls curl up inside me every time I do it. One moment, please. But anyway, despite this being a seriously impressive camera, unfortunately, the concept didn't catch on as well as Nikon may have hoped, because we never saw a successor to this camera, and most people have never even heard of it. But why? Well, this is part of the Nikon 1 series, and you may or may not know that this line of cameras was part of the company's first venture into the world of mirrorless cameras, starting in late 2011, but officially being pulled from shelves just 7 years later in mid-2018. But despite this range of cameras being resigned to the history books as somewhat of a failure, that's not to say that these cameras absolutely sucked, and actually I think there's a lot to love about this range. In fact, I recently ranked the Nikon 1J5 as one of my favourite small cameras of all time, which should speak volumes. But anyway, back to this AW1, because this is a totally different beast. You see, although it's quite a bit larger and heavier than the J5, this is still a relatively small, lightweight and stealthy option. Now, this not only makes it ideal for the obvious kind of outdoorsy stuff like landscape and astrophotography, but also candid styles of photography like street and travel too. I mean, how many times have you been out on a photo walk only for it to be cut short by bad weather? Well, with this camera, that's never going to be an issue, because there really aren't many scenarios where this thing wouldn't be up to the challenge. And what's better is that because this is now part of a discontinued range, you can buy these cameras for relatively cheap. Currently, at the time of recording, the body-only price of this camera is on eBay for around $200 to $250. Though, of course, there are some lots that include a lens or two, and these tend to go for a little bit higher, usually around the $400 to $500 mark. Now, speaking of lenses, one thing to note is that in order for this camera to be fully weather resistant, you do need to pair it with one of Nikon's all-weather lenses. Now, just to clarify, you can still use this camera with standard non-weather sealed Nikon 1 lenses, but obviously doing this will compromise its ruggedness. I did even notice that on the Nikon website, it states that if you want to use standard lenses, then you will need to protect the O-ring that's around the lens mount here with the O-ring protector, which is usually supplied with the camera. Well, this is over 11 years old now, so I had to obviously buy mine second hand, which means mine didn't come with one. And I can't seem to find any of these protector things for sale on eBay anywhere. Now, the last time I exposed my O-ring for too long, I was slapped with a fine for public indecency. I won't be making that mistake again.
You are a sad, strange little man, and you have my pity.
And so, seeing as I'm limited to just using weather-sealed lenses, what choices do I have to pick from? Well, you're looking at it. Yes, that's right. Nikon only ever got round to making 2 all-weather lenses, but luckily the lenses they did make are fairly versatile. There's this pretty standard 11 to 27.5mm f3.5 to 5.6 kit lens, and then this 10mm f2.8 prime. And because this camera uses a 1-inch sensor, this means it has a crop factor of 2.7 times. And this means in full frame terms, we're getting images with a field of view closer to something like a 30 to 74mm-ish with this zoom lens, or 27mm with this prime. Now, seeing as 28mm lenses are quickly becoming the go-to for street and travel photography these days, this prime lens is probably going to be the more desirable option for candid snappers, and it's certainly my preferred pick of the two. But before we move on to talk about the specs of the camera itself, there are 3 things that are fairly unusual to note about these lenses, which I kind of found interesting. Now, firstly, you can see that Nikon added this rubber bumper thing to the front of both of these lenses, and that's obviously there to help absorb some of the shock if you were to drop this onto the front of the camera, which honestly I think more lenses should start including as standard. Secondly, apart from the zoom ring on this zoom lens, there aren't actually any manual controls on either of these options, and that also means there's no manual focus ring. But I'll talk a little bit more about how all of this works in terms of manual focus a little bit later on. And finally, as I've already kind of touched on, because there's a rubber seal around this lens mount, this obviously creates a tight seal between the lens and the camera body to help keep water out. But this also makes getting these lenses off a lot tougher, and it kind of feels like you're going to snap the lens mount by twisting it this hard, but Just remember, this camera is a total baddie, and it likes it rough.
Thank you, Daddy.
Anyway, as I touched on earlier, this camera uses a 14 megapixel 1-inch Nikon CX sensor, and although its small size might make full frame fanatics do a little sick in their mouths, this tiny sensor really shouldn't be written off too quickly. Now, one of the benefits of using a smaller sensor is that it can offer faster readout speeds, and this in turn means that it can capture raw images at a speed of up to 60 frames per second. I mean, granted, when shooting RAWs at 60 frames per second, don't expect to capture many more than around 20 shots before everything grinds to a halt. But still, if you're shooting fast-moving subjects and you want to increase the chances of bagging a winning shot, then this could definitely make all the difference. Now, speaking of speed, I should also mention that at the time, these Nikon 1 cameras boasted one of the fastest AF systems going, and even by 2024 standards, this camera is rapid. And with the ear-piercing AF noises turned off, this is a totally silent camera in operation, making it a solid option for situations where you need to shoot quickly and quietly. Now, one slight advantage this camera has over the J5 and some other smaller cameras is that this actually makes room for a full-size SD card slot, which does help with the write speeds a little bit. But whilst we're poking around its nether regions, what's more interesting is that this battery hatch comes included with 2 separate locks, and obviously that's there to help prevent it from being opened by accident while submerging the battery in water. Yes, sir, you've got your hand up at the back there. Have you got a question?
What would happen if the battery's now underwater and there's a shark that's approximately 10 yards over there?
Honestly, I'm not sure. It's not a question I've ever been asked before. Let me get back to you on that one. Anyway, the time and consideration that the Nikon team seemingly put into the design of this camera doesn't end there. That double lock design is also present on the side hatch where the mini HDMI port is located. And they even went to the trouble of making the pop-up flash on the top here completely waterproof too, so you can actually use this underwater. But you may have also noticed that there's no mode dial on this camera, and now that's because dials can firstly be quite fiddly to use with gloves, but also could create weak spots in the design for water and frost to get in. So how do you change the shooting modes? Well, they added this rather ingenious little button on the back here, and if you hold that down, you'll get this very nautical looking dial type display. And no, this isn't some kind of mini game, though I'm sad to say that having video games integrated into cameras isn't something that I'm unfamiliar with on this channel. It has Pac-Man on it. No, this is designed so that you can toggle between the different shooting modes simply by tilting the camera, which I personally think is a super clever and ingenious solution that works really well in practice. Now, overall, I do love the ergonomics of this camera, though there are clearly some compromises that had to be made in order to prioritize its waterproof nature. Not only is there no mode dial, but there's no dials at all. That means there's no command dials, and the screen isn't touch sensitive either.
No touchy-touchy.
So this means altering the shooting parameters takes a little bit of getting used to. In full manual mode specifically, this can get a little bit fiddly because to toggle between adjusting the shutter speed and aperture, you need to tap the exposure comp shortcut button here. The only problem is that you will instinctively want to toggle between these two settings using the left and right buttons on the D-pad, but pressing left will enter you into the continuous burst mode menu. And honestly, I cannot tell you how many times I've done that by accident, and needless to say, it does get very tedious. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's no manual focus dials on either of the AW lenses, and so in order to refine focus, you first need to activate manual focus mode from inside the settings menu, then you can tap these two buttons at the top here to incrementally adjust the focus point. Can you just hold down these buttons to speed up the process? Good one. No, of course you can't. You instead have to painstakingly tap the buttons like you're button mashing an arcade machine or something, which takes what feels like a lifetime. Anyway, you didn't click on this video to hear me moan about the handling gripes of an 11-year-old camera. You're probably here because you want to know, how tough is this camera actually? Well, rather conveniently, it actually tells you right on the top of the camera here. It says that this is waterproof down to 15 meters or around 49 feet. Now, the last time I took a camera into a public swimming pool to test that kind of thing, it landed me with my second round of criminal charges, so I won't be making that mistake again.
I'm getting the word nonce.
But during a recent trip to Lake Louise in Banff National Park, park, I did use this as an opportunity to test out the waterproof capabilities of this camera, and rather unsurprisingly, it works just as well as you would expect. Now, whilst I was walking around Lake Louise, it actually reminded me of when I first traveled to Alberta right at the start of the year. More specifically, it reminded me what a huge pain in the arse it was actually getting there, because my UK phone plan didn't cover North America at the time, so I had no signal and no data. Luckily, since then, I've discovered the magic of using eSIMs, much like today's sponsor, Saily. Now, with an eSIM from Saily, I can instantly connect to local networks in over 180 countries. It's really simple to do, just download the Saily app, choose your plan, and you're connected. No more unexpected roaming fees or hunting for local SIM cards. So the next time you're traveling abroad, be sure to use the link and the discount code in the video description below to receive 15% off your first Saily eSIM. Now, one thing it doesn't mention on the top of this camera, probably because they've run out of space, is that this is also freeze-proof down to temperatures as low as -10 degrees Celsius, which is around 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And at Lake Louise on that specific day, the temperature rather conveniently happened to be around -10 degrees Celsius. So rather than sticking my camera in my jacket pocket like I normally would, I actually made a point of hanging it from my wrist strap outside of my jacket for the entire hour or so that we were there. Despite being exposed to the sub-zero conditions, not only did this camera continue to function without any issues at all, I also can't tell you how liberating it was just to have a camera you really don't need to worry about breaking. Anyway, also on the top here, it says that this thing is shockproof from heights up to 2 meters or 6.6 feet. And I'll be honest, this is one of the tests that made me the most nervous. So I started off nice and gentle by simply lobbing it around the backyard in the snow, which it kind of shrugged off with no issues at all, unsurprisingly. Though, just to note, if you are planning on using this in the snow, probably don't get the white version like I did, because it can make it a little bit tricky to locate it. Anyway, next I wanted to take it up a notch, and I decided to drop it from roughly 2 meters onto my frozen driveway. And yes, I promise there is block paving under all of that snow. So on the first drop, the lens took the brunt of the damage, and it created this nice little dent on the front here, which I didn't think looked too good. Now, although the camera would turn on okay, unfortunately the display was black, and I was concerned that this meant that it was totally lights out for this old girl on attempt number 1. But after a little bit of fiddling around, I discovered that this only happened when the zoom was set to either end of the zoom range, so either 11mm or 27.5mm. Setting it to somewhere in the middle of the zoom range brought it back to life, and it would still expose properly and take a photo. So, I mean, that's far from being a full-blown victory for the lens at least, but I wanted to see how the camera itself would fare with this kind of drop. And after the second attempt, I dropped it on the lens again. Okay, third time's the charm, and this time it landed directly on the back of the camera. So will it turn on? Well, yeah, and it looked like it survived the fall, though not entirely unscathed. Now, if you look closely, you can see that the screen had picked up a little bit of damage, but aside from that, it was still working absolutely fine, and cosmetically, it didn't have so much as a scratch on the camera body, but I wanted to really push this camera to its limits. And yes, before you ask, I did actually clear away the snow from beneath the bridge, so that meant that this camera was dropping from around 13 meters or 43 feet onto frozen rocks. But did it survive? Well, after turning it on, it displayed this message, and considering that at the time of filming it was around -8 degrees Celsius, I've got to say I was somewhat skeptical about this claim that the internals were overheating. But nonetheless, I brought it home and thawed it out a little bit, because I thought, who knows, it might have just gotten too cold and was just displaying the wrong kind of temperature warning message or something like that. So after all of that, does it still work? Well, rather incredibly, no, it's totally f***ed. So needless to say, I think we've officially pushed this camera past its limits. And honestly, after seeing the damage it picked up after dropping it just 2 meters, I can't really say that I had much confidence in its abilities to survive that kind of fall. Now, I know there might be some of you who are probably pretty mad at me right now for destroying a perfectly good camera, but before you practically trip over yourself running to the comments to unload on me, I do have a small confession to make. I also really didn't like the idea of smashing up a perfectly good camera, so I actually bought 2, and this second copy was actually slightly faulty to begin with. Firstly, the pop-up flash on this thing won't stay down as the latch is totally broken, and I actually had to tape it closed for those tests. Plus, the battery compartment on the bottom here is totally broken, and it means you just cannot get it open without having to pry it open with tools. Now, the lens that I got with it was also pretty beat up to start with, and this is just a kit lens, so they're fairly easy to get hold of, unlike the 10mm prime, which is way harder to get hold of, and I certainly was not willing to risk destroying that thing. Now, whilst I did genuinely hope that the second camera would survive all of that rough treatment, I figured that in the name of science at least, I would much rather risk writing off an already semi-broken camera rather than this pristine copy. So hopefully you're not too mad at me for doing that, soz. But anyway, we're not quite done yet, because ultimately that's great that this thing takes such a beating, but if it can't take a good photo, then it's probably not worth buying in the first place. So what is the image quality like? Well, firstly, bear in mind that this is a 13-year-old camera, so I'd be lying to you if I sat here and told you that it captures the best images that I've ever seen. But starting with the positives, despite its age and small size, this 1-inch sensor is actually able to pack in plenty of detail and renders nice, natural looking colors straight out of the camera. Sure, the dynamic range isn't the greatest, and even while shooting at lower ISOs, don't be surprised to see some noise creeping in from the shadows if you try to manipulate the files too harshly. But that said, if you know your way around Lightroom or Photoshop, then neither of those issues will be too much of a problem for you. Now, another thing to consider is that achieving a shallow depth of field isn't going to be all that easy either, even when shooting close up and wide open with this 10mm f2.8 prime. So for bokeholics, this might be a slight turn off, but for street, travel, landscape, and astrophotographers who relish images with a deeper depth of field, this camera is a pretty sweet setup in my opinion at least. But despite the impressive lengths that Nikon went to crafting this rather unique camera, just 5 years after its conception, the entire Nikon 1 range was scrapped and we never got to see a successor to the AW1. But hey, that doesn't mean that we can't still appreciate this little aquatic warrior. Its lineage may have dried up, but in our hearts, it's still making waves. Get it? Because of the waterproofing and stuff? Never mind.